I encourage people to sit closer to the front if you can, because I know the sound is horrible in the back. It echoes a lot, so you'll probably understand more because I'm going to do English if you're in the front. All right, no habla español, sorry. So I'll be in English. So hi, I'm Mike Potter. I am a software architect at Phase 2. You probably have seen me talk about things like features in the past. I'm the module maintainer for features. Also the architect for OpenAtrium 2 and D7. I'm curious, who is using Drupal 8 right now? Okay, so a good amount. And who considers themselves still new to Drupal 8? Okay, because I marked this as an intermediate class, but it also occurred to me that some people are like still using Drupal 7 and maybe just getting into Drupal 8. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of intro at the beginning for people that haven't used it a lot, but hopefully we'll get time to get to some really newer advanced stuff at the end. But of course I always talk too much. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to quickly review what configuration management is in Drupal 8. Then we're going to talk about how you should be doing it. So the regular workflow, some problems that configuration still has in Drupal 8, and how to solve those problems, specifically problems around how to handle multiple environments and multi-site, how to override config, what role does features still play, and then some new stuff on templates and actions. So to start with, let's quickly review the problem we're trying to solve here. And this has been a problem with every CMS, including Drupal, for a long time. And the problem is we have this giant database, and in that database you have a lot of stuff. And some of that stuff is content, and some of that stuff we call configuration. And content is created by the developers. Your configuration is created by developers. Your configuration is things like your content types and your fields and your views and all the little checkboxes in Drupal. That's all configuration. And that's coming from your developers. The content, which are your pages and articles and blogs and comments, those are being created by your production users. And so you have these two pieces of data coming from two different sites. You somehow have to merge those together into a single database. So in Drupal 7, what did we do? Well, there wasn't a good way to do it in Drupal 7. So we have the features module, which I inherited about 6 years ago, rewrote a few times. And what the features module did was it extracted the configuration and it wrote it to PHP code modules. And now you could treat those modules just like the rest of your code on the site that comes from the developers. So now you could take a production database with all your production content, and then you could just load your features and overwrite that config, and now you've merged the two databases. So how do we do this now in Drupal 8? Drupal 8 recognized that this was one of the key problems and wanted to solve it in core, which was great. It's nice to see your module kind of get that recognition, and I didn't have to work on any of the core stuff, so that was awesome. But what you do in Drupal 8 is you run something called config export that does just what it says. It exports the config, and now instead of writing it to modules in features, it writes it to a directory on your site called config sync or whatever else you want to call it, and it stores every piece of config. Oh, sorry, we're getting feedback. It stores your config in config YAML files. YAML is just a data format, so now instead of using PHP code to store data, which was always kind of weird, right? You had problems with integers and string values. Now it's actually in YAML, which is meant for data. So that's how D8 is solving this. So here's how you're supposed to do D8. You start with your development server, and you export, you get it all working, like you add your content types, you add your views, you get it all working. You now export your config. I think that's better. Tell me, is this less echoey, better, or worse? Much better, okay. We'll do that. I like to walk around anyway. Okay, now as long as we don't get too mic feedback. Okay, so you take your development environment, and you export all that config, and it gets put in this config sync directory that we just talked about. Now you go over to your staging or QA server or whatever your testing server is, and you do config import. That pulls all of that data, all that config from the config sync directory and loads it into your database. So now you have the config with your staging data, and so now your testers go and test the site, make sure it's all working. Maybe they find some things to change. They just go ahead and export config back to the config sync directory. And now when you want to go to production, your production does a config import, and now you have your config along with your production data. And again, you've merged those two databases. And what's great about this method, and the reason I encourage people in Drupal 8 to do this, is you've done all your testing on QA. You know QA works. This ensures that production is a clone of QA. So if it worked on production, or if it worked on QA, it's going to work on production. In the old features world, what did we do instead? We exported our features, and then on production, we did like a feature revert all or something, right? And that would load the features into the database. And how many of us have forgotten to featureize something, right? On QA, it's like, hey, change this view. You change it, you forget to stick in your feature, you push to production, and your client says, I thought we told you to fix this, like you closed the ticket, how come it's not fixed? And you're like, you know. So in D8, we don't have that problem. In D8, you get all the config all the time. So the way you do this more specifically is first you have to tell Drupal where this config sync directory lives. So in your settings.php file, you'll see a new line that says config directories, and sync is the default, kind of the default name that Drupal core is going to use. If you just say drush config export or even Drupal console, it's going to use sync by default. But you can add other labels to that, so you can actually create multiple directories if you want. You'll see that used sometimes. For example, Acquia does this because here, as you see, we're going to want this directory to be something we can put in our Git repo. But on Acquia servers and some other production servers, you can't just write to any old directory on production. The only directory you can write to is your files directory. And so they'll have, you know, files/config sync is the default location. And sometimes you might want to have your import location different from your export location because maybe you don't want the client to overwrite your repo. But basically you specify where it is in your settings.php and then put this in your repo. This directory now contains everything that features used to generate for you. And of course you put your feature modules into your code repo, right? Just like any other modules. So put this directory into your Git repo and treat this as a giant directory of all of your features. And then on your dev, after you've made some changes, you run drush config export. That will update the stuff in the config sync directory. You then review those changes, and you're going to push that to your develop branch in your Git repo. Now I highlight the review changes here. This is probably the key difference in where you're going to end up spending a lot of your time in Drupal 8. Because unlike with features, it's like, hey, I'm working on the blog feature, and I'm going to update that, and I'm going to put it in my Git repo. Like you knew that you were just messing with that one module, right? When you do a full config export, it's exporting all the config on the site. So maybe you were working on the blog module, like maybe that was your ticket, but maybe you also had another ticket you were working on with the article content type. And the article content type's not done yet, you're not ready, but you need to get the blog feature out, right? So you do a config export, and now you look in your Git status, and it's like, oh my God, it wrote all of the article stuff. I'm not ready for that yet. So you end up having to do a git add-p and kind of pick and choose, hey, I want this file, I want this file. Do that, like make sure that you're not adding stuff, make sure you're not committing stuff that's not ready yet. Because when your next developer does a poll, and they're going to do, they're going to go on their site and do a config import, you don't want them to get that article that you're in the middle of working on, right? You just want them to get the blog. So you have to be a little bit more careful. You have to be really good at Git. So if you don't know Git, get good at Git and monitor your changes and feel free, like create new branches. Maybe, hey, there's this hot fix I need to do, back up your database, pull in a clean database, switch to a different branch, do your fix there, config export, now it's nice and clean, and then switch back to your other database that you're working on. So that's the normal workflow now in D8. Just a quick quick extra info for people that haven't done this. I'm focusing on Drush here, but you can config export and import with console as well. There's a lot of options if you look at config export, and they're mostly having to do with Git. Like there's options to do add and commit and push. Just learn how to use Git, I think. I'm not quite sure why we're trying to put Git stuff into Drush there. Use Drush for the export, but go ahead and do your normal Git commands. Don't rely on how it's going to do things. There's this label, which I mentioned. If you leave it out, it's going to look for that sync key in your settings.php. But if you do have multiple config directories specified, you can give that label there. When you do a config import, you can also use that label. But one of the really useful ones here is config import will tell you what it's about to change. It's kind of like doing a git merge. It will say, hey, I see this new config or this changed config. But all it tells you is the file names that have changed. And if you want to see the details, you can say -- preview equals diff, and it will actually show you the text diff between your old configuration and your new configuration. So now instead of just seeing system site changes, you can see, oh, it's actually the site title that changed from this to that. So that's a really useful option. The -- partial option we'll look at in a second. So why is this not so easy sometimes? Okay. Why are we still having trouble with config and we're almost to Drupal 8.4? I thought we solved all this, right? So what are the new headaches? Like we all know what features did to us, but what are the new headaches that we now have? So the first thing to understand is something called your site UUID, unique identifier. When you first install Drupal, Drupal is going to create a random number, random UUID, and that is the ID of your site. And it stores that in config. It's in the system.site settings file. When you do a config import, or when you do a config export, of course it exports that out. And now if I give that export file to you and you try to import it on your site has a different UUID. And config export is going to refuse to import. It's going to try to import and say, oh, your site UUID doesn't match, and you won't be able to import it. So that causes trouble. Like how do we can't reuse our config, right? So even worse than that, not only does your site have a UUID, but every config item has a UUID. So when you create a new field in the user interface and you export that, if you go look at that field.yaml file, you'll see a UUID. And if you then try to import that on a site where I've created the same field, like maybe you've updated something, but I did the creation myself, I've got a different UUID, config import will complain. Sometimes it will complain and tell you so and it won't work. Sometimes it will go ahead and do it, and then later you'll run cron, and you'll go look at your Drupal status page and it will say that you have uncommitted entity changes or something like that because it thinks the schema changed when it really didn't. So again, the UUIDs there can cause trouble. The other time you'll run into trouble is, again, during config import. Config import will try to delete config. If you remove one of those YAML files, like one of your field.yaml files, when you do the config import, it will delete that field from your site. Well, what if you have content in that field? Well, it doesn't want you to lose content, so it will give you an error. It will say there's pre-existing content for that entity, you must remove it. Now what's really great is it doesn't actually tell you what entity you need to remove, so you don't know, is it a field, is it a content type, is it a paragraph, is it a view? Like, it just says you have existing content, you must remove it. And then so again, you're like, I just need to import the content. So that can be a problem. So how do we solve some of these problems? So the first thing that some people have tried is there's this option on config import called partial. So what partial does is, kind of what it doesn't do is it won't delete config. If it sees a missing YAML file for a field, but the field's in the database, it leaves the field in the database. It doesn't try to delete it. And so it doesn't complain if you have existing content. But what's the problem with that? Okay? Let's say I'm importing, again, I'm working on a blog and I'm not done and I'm trying to do this hot fix. And so they say, hey Mike, go do this fix. You know, I switched to master, I do a poll of master, I do a config import with partial, and now I get a mix. I've got the production config, but I've still got my blog that I'm in the middle of. And so once again, when I do this hot fix and I try to do a config export, it's going to export all this dirty config. So I call this dirty config. You're merging two pieces of config, and now you don't really know what you have. And now if you push that up to production, you could have a broken site. So partial is very dangerous unless you're really super careful about looking at exactly what's changing. So it's there if you have an emergency and you absolutely have to get an import somehow and you know what you're doing, but I don't recommend using this as a general practice. Okay, so the other thing with config is, as I said, you've got this site UID problem. So if developer number 1 is creating our site, and maybe it's one of you guys, right? And you're phase 2, and we say, hey, go create these content types and send them to us. So you install Drupal, you create the content types, you send me your config sync directory, and now I can't import it because my site UID is different. So how do we fix that? So how do you install a site using config? So the first thing to do is, on your projects, first get a fresh start. So the very first time, this is probably something that your tech lead or architect or somebody's going to do, but somebody is going to be the first one to install whatever client site you're working on, right? It might be you, it might be your tech lead. Whoever is the first one is probably going to just use a command like this. I recommend creating a profile, and you'll see why in a minute. Even if it's just an empty profile, just create a profile. A profile is just a module that lives in the profile directory. Doesn't have to have anything in it. Your .info file doesn't have to have anything in it, but just create one with a name, and again, you'll see why in a minute. So you then do drush site install and the name of your profile. And if you weren't using a profile, you'd just say like standard or one of the Drupal core profiles here. So that's going to install Drupal, right? We do this all the time. That's going to create your first site UUID. So now go into your settings.php file and check a couple things. So first, it should have set the profile name to whatever your profile name is, but just double check to make sure it's okay. And then look at that sync directory that we talked about earlier and set its location to wherever you're storing it in your Git repo, like config/sync or config/default. So set that up. And now don't do anything else yet. You haven't created any content types or fields. This is just plain Drupal with a clean profile. Do a config export and put that in your Git repo. So do a git add config sync and commit it and push it. So what you've got now is a clean site with a clean configuration directory. So now you can always go back to this at some point. If you get your site all messed up, you can always go back to the clean configuration that you started with. So now what do you do with this? How does the next developer use this? So the next developer comes along and they need to install a site using that config without having a site UID conflict. And there's 3 ways to do this, and this is relatively new. I don't think anybody's really doing this right yet, but there is a core patch that's within the last few months. What you do here, and I'll tell you what the patch is in a second, but first you go into your profile, and in your profile.info file, you add this key called config install. And you tell it where you stored your config. So it's the same thing that you put in your settings.php, but this is stored in your profile. Because your settings.php is site-specific, right? You're going to have your local database host name and ID name and everything else. I'm going to have mine. You want the profile itself to own the configuration. So set where the configuration is. And now get this patch, and it's way down there at the bottom, but my slides will be online. This patch is doing pretty well. It's almost RTBC'd. They're trying to get it for 8.4, but we're getting close to the cutoff time for that, so I don't know if it will make it. It's being worked on by a lot of core people and configuration people like Alex Pott and those guys. But what this lets you do is install your profile using that config sync directory. So when you go and run your drush site install, you run the exact same command, just drush site install the name of your profile. And what it does is it notices that config install key and says, oh, you want to install your site from config. And so the first thing it does is it goes into that config directory and figures out what the site UID was of your previous site. it then sets your site ID to the same value. Then it does all of the import of the config. So now you don't have any conflicts. The other key thing is it's doing this as part of the install process. It's not doing this after the install, as some of the other methods will do. So if your profile has its own configuration, like maybe your profile has some configuration in its config install directory, that configuration is going to get installed properly merged with whatever's in your config sync directory. So again, the config UUIDs will match. So if your config sync directory has a field, and that field is also in the config install directory, you'll get the same proper config UUID for that field. So it's a great patch. I've had good luck with it. I've used it on Lightning. I've used it on lots of profiles. Works really well. Now there is another trick is they're trying to actually make it even easier. Instead of having your config directory located anywhere you want, if you decide to put your config sync directory inside the profile directory and call it config/sync, then you don't actually have to put that config install key in your info file. It will automatically see the config sync directory and install the site from config. So this is Core's attempt to support installing a site from config, because really config is your site. Other than the content piece, it defines how your site works. So I think this is going to be a great step forward for Drupal 8. The two other methods that people I've seen use, with Drush, they added an option called -config-dir. So you can say drush site install, profile name, and then config sync, config-dir equals config sync. This was an attempt to do the same thing. The problem is Drush doesn't have control over the full install process. So this still does it as 2 steps. It patches in the site UID, then it installs the profile normally, and then it does a config import. And that almost works. And most people think it works, but what happens is this is the case where if you run cron, you can then have that problem in your system's status settings where if your profile created its own config, the config UIDs don't match, and so it thinks the schema might have changed. And I found this with Lightning, and there's an issue posted there to the Lightning issue queue on GitHub. But I actually reproduced this with the standard profile because standard installs like the page content type, right, and the article content type. So if you just do a drush site install of standard, export the config, and then try to use this on a fresh site to install standard, then run cron, go to the status page, you'll see all of these schema changes. So it's actually a bug in Core, but they're fixing it, and they're fixing it through that patch I just showed you, okay? So we don't need to do this anymore. The other thing people used to use is the config installer profile. And this was something that Alex from chapter 3 initially put together to kind of raise awareness of this whole problem. This is a profile that you can download from Drupal.org, and what it does is in the installer, it prompts you for the location of your config sync directory, or it prompts you to upload like a tarball of your config, and it tries to install the site from that. And it was a good first attempt, but it hasn't been updated since February. It doesn't work with Lightning. I've had some bugs with it. I don't think it's being maintained anymore. I haven't actually talked to Alex about it, but since Alex is working on that other patch, I think, again, that patch is superseding this project. So probably want to stop using this project. Okay, so those are 3 ways, but I showed you the good way with the patch. That should take care of all your site UUID issues. If you're on an existing project and you're trying to convert and you just have to somehow patch it, here's the procedure. So you go to your system site config, there's your UUID, you copy and paste it, and then you can use the drush config set command, and it's kind of hard to read there, sorry for the color. So you basically say drush config set, you say I want to set something in the system.site config, I want to set the UUID, and then here's the value. That will patch in the site UUID. Now this isn't going to help you with all of those config UUIDs for like your fields and stuff, so you still have that issue. So this is only for emergencies. Okay, what about updates? So sometimes you update modules and they change your config schema. And so there's the common question of, do I run updates first or do I do a config import first? And so here's the proper steps. You do a git pull. Now, when you do a git pull, you might have a new composer lock file, like somebody might have updated a module version. So you run composer install, and that ensures that all of your modules are up to date with the same versions. One of those updates might have changed the schema, so you now need to run updates first to allow that module's update hooks to do whatever cleanup it needs for whatever update they just did to it. And then after running update hooks is when you run config import, because now you have a clean schema. So that's the correct order. And in fact, Core is about to enforce this in 8.4. This is the patch that they're almost ready to commit. If you try to run config import and it sees pending updates, it's going to refuse to do the import. So you'll have to run updates first. So that's a good thing. Okay, how are we doing here? Okay, we're fine. So another common problem with config in D8, or even in D7, is the whole idea in Drupal 8 is the configuration is owned by the site, which is different. In Drupal 7, configuration was owned by the modules, like they were owned by the feature modules. If a module changed config, you did a feature update, that config took over. In Drupal 8, the whole site owns the config and it's all in the config sync directory. The config that's in a module, it's in the config/install, and that name should tell you that config is only read in when you install the module. Once the module's installed, you can change that config and it will never have any effect because it's already been loaded, it's already been imported. So if you want to change config, you have to change it in that whole site config sync directory. So the problem is sites are not identical. Even within the same project, your dev, stage, and prod sites aren't identical. For example, you have the devel module probably enabled on your development machine. It's not enabled on production. If you're hosting on Acquia on your production site, you probably have Acquia connector and Acquia search installed. You don't have those on your dev. You probably have a Google Analytics API key on production. You don't want that same API key on your dev because then all of the testing you do is going to pollute the client's Google Analytics page and they'll hate you, so don't do that. So the config is actually different between these sites. And yet Drupal 8 wants it to be the same. And that's a problem. And so there's now a fix to this problem. The fix to this problem is a module called config split. This is a relatively new module. I'd say within the last year, it's starting to get a lot of attention. It's recently been built into the Acquia BLT tools, their build tools, as they've removed features and gone to config split, which is good. So what config split does is it says, here's some config that I don't want in the config sync directory. I want it somewhere else. And so you create a split for each of your environments. So here is the workflow. For each of your environments, you create a directory. And it's in the same, usually I put it in the same config directory. So if config sync or config default is my kind of master sync directory, I'll create config/prod, config/stage, config/dev, right? Because I'll put the entire config directory in my repo. So all of the subdirectories will automatically also be in my repo. So you have to create these directories manually. The config split module will not create these for you. So you have to create these manually with makedir. So once you've created that, you then go into the config split UI. And that UI allows you to create these splits. So you create one for each environment and disable all of them by default. The idea is you have prod, dev, stage, they're disabled, and at runtime, you're going to enable one of those. But in the configuration, you want them all to be disabled to start with. So you do that, and now you export the config. And what you're doing in the UI is you're telling config split what config you want in each of those directories. So you would, for example, say, I want my Google Analytics key to be in prod, and I want the devel module to be in dev, okay? Now it does this through something called a blacklist. So all of the modules that are on your site are normally going to get enabled. And then what config split's going to do is it's going to look at any modules that you have in your blacklist, and it's going to turn those off. So your normal config, for example, would have devel turned on everywhere and Acquia connector turned on everywhere. And then in config split, you would say on devel or on dev, blacklist Acquia connector, because I don't want that, blacklist Google API. And on prod, I would say blacklist devel. And that's one of its tricks, is it kind of does that after the import, because one detail is the list of modules enabled on your site is configuration. It's stored in the core.extensions config. So when you do a config import, that's going to enable all the modules. But your modules aren't the same, and so config split kind of patches that in and does the blacklist magic during the import. Okay, so then you need to tell it which one to enable. So you go into your settings.php file and you tell it, hey, I'm on prod, enable the prod split, or I'm on dev, enable the dev split. There's usually some way in your environments to figure out what you're on. Again, if you're on Acquia, there's an environment variable that says prod stage dev. If you're on some other hosting, there's usually an environment variable or some other directory. So you can figure that out, and in your settings.php, you say enable this split, and when you do your config import, it will import the main config default directory and merge your split and import the rest. So it just kind of takes it from multiple places. So here's the picture. So you're on dev, you do a config import, and it's going to import the default config plus whatever's in your dev split. Here I've called it local instead of dev, but it's the same idea. So it merges that together. And so now you're working on your dev site, you make your changes, you do a config export. Config export only exports the main config. It doesn't change your split. And now you go to stage, you do a config import on stage, it imports the master config, but then it also merges in whatever in your stage directory, your stage split. And then you config export again, it goes to your main, and now in production, when you do a config import, it's going to take your main config and merge your production, right? I think you get the idea. So your config flows from dev to prod, but at each environment, you're able to inject this different configuration. They also have a way to do overrides. So they have, in addition to their black list, something called a gray list. What the gray list is it's config that lives both in this default sync and in your split. So maybe you have a default value for config, but on dev you just need to override it with something. That's called a gray list, and it can handle that as well. If you actually do need to update one of these split locals, there's a command called config split export that will export the config to the actual split directory. So it's a really interesting module. Like I say, a lot of people are starting to use it, so take a look at that. Now we talked a little bit about overriding with the gray list. What are some other ways you can override config? So there's something that I call runtime overrides. This is where you go into your settings.php, kind of like you did in D7. You can specify a value in the config array and override a piece of configuration like the site name or the Google API key. Like I see people do this a lot for Google API keys. They go into their settings.prod and they say, here's my API key. So that's doing an override, okay? You can't add new configuration and you can't delete configuration, but you can change existing configuration this way. There's also the config override module, and the config override module lets you do this within a module, and it lets you implement or extend this core factory overrides class. This is actually how the translation system works for config. So when you've got multiple language site names, it's like the Spanish site name is stored in the translation config, and it gets loaded as a runtime override. So the tricky part about this is the overrides only affect what's called immutable config. So immutable config, sorry, it's a horrible word, that's basically read-only config. So what is this? So immutable config is in your modules or in your code, if you call config and say, give me the system site configuration, you're going to get a read-only version of that. You can look at it, but there's no save method. You can't change it. And that value will get changed by whatever overrides are in place. So if you try to get the site name and the person is set on a Spanish site, you're going to get the Spanish site name. There's another way to get config, which is through the config factory get editable method. And as the method kind of indicates, this is a read-write version of config. This is something you can change, and then there's a save method for it. Overrides don't apply here. So if I use this to get the site title, I don't get the Spanish site name. I get the site name that's actually shown in the Drupal UI. And in fact, this is what the Drupal UI uses for its form. So what you see in the form, if you go to your configuration page, is kind of the master site name, not the overridden site name. And you can change it and save it, and you're saving that value. But then if something is using the read-only config, it's not going to see what you just stored, it's going to see the overridden version. And so that's why I call this kind of a UI problem. If you try to use overrides like settings.php to override your Google Analytics key, when you go to the Google Analytics module to look at it, you won't see your key. It'll probably be blank or something. And your client will say, hey, I thought I told you to set my API key. When I go to the UI, it shows it as blank. And you're like, yeah, don't worry, it's set in settings.php. And they'll try to change it and save it, and they'll wonder why their changes don't take effect. So that's the problem with overrides. Just be aware of that. Okay, so what about features? How many people have seen my blog in the last week? None of you? Oh, just one person, okay. So what about features? So features was designed to package configuration together into modules. And in D7, that was the only way we could export config. But we just showed you how you do that in D7 or in D8 without features. We needed to be able to reuse functionality cross-site. The example I often give is like the photo gallery, right? We're going to use features, we're going to create a photo gallery, and isn't this great and wonderful because now you could just take that feature and put it on your site, and now you have a photo gallery too. We also used it for distributions. I used it in OpenAtrium a ton for all of its pieces of functionality because you could turn those features on and off. If you didn't want events, you just turned off the event feature. And it was just a nice way to organize. And in D7, it was all we had. But features, of course, has problems, and I'm sure we've all experienced some of these problems. In D8, it actually gets much worse. So we've always had this problem of what do you put in your feature? Does the field storage go along with the field instance? Does it go with the content type? I don't know, you kind of trust, you go into features, you click some boxes, you cross your fingers, you click right, and you hope everything is good. But we've run into this, right? Where you have to split your field storage into a separate feature because of dependencies. What if you have a case where you have an article and a blog, and you want to add a related content field, which is an entity reference, because your client wants to be able to show related content. Well, what kind of related content do they want to show? They want to show articles and blogs. So on your article content type, you have an entity reference field that references blogs and articles. On your blog content type, you have a shared entity reference field that references blogs and articles. Kind of sounds like a circular dependency loop, right? And in fact, if you go into features and you try to featureize either of those two things, it will do it, and then when you take one of those to another site and try to enable it, it will refuse to enable because it will say you have unmet dependencies. And so it's like, okay, I have to put my field storage somewhere else, so you do that, and it still says unmet dependencies. What you actually have to do is take the content type itself and put it in its own feature, and then it will work, but features doesn't do that for you automatically, and most people, like, at that point have given up. So you get this kind of dependency hell figuring out what to put in what features. I don't know how about you, but the new assignment plugin, so I have a co-maintainer of features, which is Nejo, and he's really into profiles and these assignment plugins, and I haven't even really figured out how they work myself sometimes, but you know, that can cause problems too if you get that configured wrong. So dependency hell. The other thing that you can run into with features in D8 is if you try to mix features with the normal config import export, you can have problems. So they're like, hey, Mike says I should use config import export. So great, I'm going to have a config sync directory. I'm going to do my import and export. Oh, but I still have these features I want to use. Well, features, when features exports config, it strips out the UUID because it wants you to be able to reuse that config on multiple sites. So when you import that feature, it creates the UUID for that field or content type, right? And now when you go to another site and do a feature revert, they get a different UUID. And so now again, you've got mismatched UUIDs, and when you try to do the config export and share it, when I try to do the config import, it's going to give me import errors. So it's kind of even worse now in D8. And features aren't actually reusable. So yes, this is me, the maintainer of features, saying stop using my module. A year ago, it was used on 3% of Drupal 8 sites. Today, it's being used on 7% of Drupal 8 sites, so it's getting worse. So stop it. Okay. So why? Well, for most cases, 90% of the cases, you can use core configuration management the way I described earlier today without features. Just put your config in YAML files, version control it, you get all the config, you don't have to worry about where your storage goes or where your instance goes. They just all get stored in config sync. It's just all in one place. You never have any dependency issues when you do an import because all your dependencies are all there. Use config split to handle the environment specific stuff. So some people used to use features for this. They would have like a prod module and a dev module and they would turn one on or turn the other one on. You can use config split now instead. And you know, organization feels nice. Like this is where I've struggled. Like I like having a blog module with all of the related blog config like all nicely together. And I don't really like this idea of dumping everything into one giant directory, right? I mean, we don't dump our code into one giant code file, like we split it up. So it's kind of hard to get over this organizational need. But really, when you start working with config and give it a chance, you'll find that it's actually not bad because the files are named pretty well. You can tell if something's a blog or a field that you've named. Look at those YAML files. Don't treat them as a black box. Edit them just like you would edit code and look at that. If you need to change the help text for a field, it's like, yeah, you could go into the UI and go find it and change the help text. Or you could just go edit the .yaml file and where it says, you know, description, put your help text in and save it and put it in your Git repo. So it can actually be easier to use it without features. I haven't used features now in a few months, and I haven't actually missed it. So give it a try. But what about distributions? Anybody here build distributions? Okay, not many. It's a very small edge case, and this is kind of why I'm saying don't use features, because the reason for features is a very small percentage of sites. So what I mean by a distribution is kind of a reusable profile. This is something like OpenAtrium, where I'm going to build a distribution and it's going to be installed by thousands of sites, and it's got functionality that you want to turn on and off, and most importantly, it's something you want to keep updated. You know, if you don't just take OpenAtrium and use that as a starting point. Well, some people do, but you usually don't use it as a starting point and then customize it and never go back. Usually when there's a new update to Atrium with security releases, you want to be able to apply that update to your site. And that was really hard, even in 7 with distributions. But that's what a distribution is. With profiles, you don't tend to update them once they're out there. You just let the client customize it. So the way you do distributions is, you know, and the other problem with distributions is, let's say we use this method I described with that core patch. So what if we made our config sync directory, like what if we had an OpenAtrium config sync directory, and we just put that in as part of our distribution, and now when you install Atrium, you would get all that config? Well, that's great, except then everybody would have exactly the same UUIDs on all their sites. And UUIDs do exist for a reason. There's a reason why we don't want all of our sites to have the same UUIDs, otherwise they wouldn't exist. There's security implications and things, like you don't necessarily want people to know your ID. It's not quite as, you know, important as like your secret Starship ID or something like that you can hack into, but like it's there for a reason. So that's why you can't use that method with the config sync directory with a distribution. So what you need to do is, for your distribution functionality, you create a module, you put the config install directory, you put the config in there, and you remove the UUID so that you can reuse that module on another site. And gee, that sounds pretty much like what features does, right? So why not reuse it? I think we're almost to the closing point here, so we're getting good. So to do that reusable functionality, this is like going back to that photo gallery. I want to make a photo gallery, and I want to give it to you and let you use the photo gallery. So features were supposed to be reusable. And I'm sorry, but it was a lie, because they're not. And we've all found this, right? If you've tried to do this, configuration and features contain project-specific machine names. So here's an example, and it's probably hard to read, so I apologize. But this is what an image field, or this is what a field looks like in Drupal 8. So this is a YAML file. I've created a field called project image, and I've put it on a content type called project blog. And if you look inside that YAML file, I've highlighted in orange all the machine names. So let's say my project is NBA, and I've got NBA blog, and we want to reuse that on, you know, MLS. Well, MLS probably doesn't want to have a blog called NBA blog, right? They want to call it MLS blog. And so what do? You go in here and you manually change everything and edit everything. You know, it's like renaming a module. You go find all the places it says NBA, you change it to MLS. So it's not actually reusable. If you then improve this somehow, there's no way for you to give me a pull request with your improved photo gallery because you've changed all your machine names. So it's not reusable. So how could we maybe fix this? So what if we took that same YAML file config and we took all this stuff in orange and we replaced it with variable names. So here I've put @ field name, @ bundle. So I've added variable names. So what if we had a way to use this to create config and we call this a template? And so now we want to use this template. So kind of like how you do twig in Drupal 8 where you say use this twig template with this data, like you do an include and say with, and then you give it your data mapping. It's kind of the same idea here. You're saying let's use the field template, let's set the field name and bundle to these values, and then let's store this where Drupal wants to store the config, which has the variables in it. Like you want to store it to, you know, field node, project blog, project image in the database. Even better, what if we could also take that template and while we're doing the variable replacements, do a few overrides. So I don't just want that plain field, I probably want a human readable name for it, I probably want some nice help text, you know, maybe I want to make it required, so you can specify some changed values for that configuration. So that is what a new module that I'm working on does, called config actions. What config actions is more of a developer API module at this point, but it's a way to specify things called actions, like I just showed you. You create a YAML file that basically says, take this configuration, apply these changes to it, and resave it. So if you want to think about like the rules module or something, it's kind of like that. You're saying, you know, do these steps. Each step is an action. And it's a very pluggable system, and there's plugins for changing config, adding config, deleting config. It will load YAML files as templates. It will also just load existing config. So you can say, load my existing field config, change this value, resave it. And that's an action. When you put that action in a module, kind of like you did with features, when you enable the module, the actions get run. Kind of similar to the feature revert, there's a drush command called config action run, or car. So you can say drush car, give it the name of your action, and it will run that action. And you can do all sorts of great config manipulations this way that the core people would probably be really upset that we're able to do, because you can get past all of their little tests for UUIDs and everything else this way. It's great for writing update hooks. You know, hey, in this update hook, we refactored and we deleted that old field. If you try to delete that field in your config import process, it's going to complain you have pre-existing data or you have other issues. Here you can basically create an action that says, hey, go delete this config, you know, change this to that, map this, do that kind of stuff. So there's a link there for the docs. It's currently in beta. There's a lot of automated testing, so go look at the tests and they will kind of show you examples of all the cool things you can do with it. The docs also have a lot of examples in it. So if you feel the urge in D8 to make a feature, if you have the time, stop and take a look at this and see if there's a way to convert your feature into an action, because this stuff will not interfere with your config install process and you won't get all those dependency issues. Now, even beyond that, there's another new module, and this one's just in dev. This one uses config actions, and this is kind of where features is going. So what we also realized is features is actually not a bad UI, and people have gotten used to using it to say, hey, can you just export this content type, and it automatically figures out all your dependencies and it writes it all out for you. What config templates does is it includes templates for a lot of common things, like all your common field types, content types, and so forth. And it adds a button to the bottom of features, because features is very pluggable. So now down there where you have the download and write buttons, there's now a write to action button. And what write to actions does is it looks at your config and it compares it with the template, and it creates an action file for you that contains the overrides. So in that example I showed you previously, it would create that, use this template, set the bundle to this, set the field to this, here's my description, here's my help text. That actually came from an automated generation from the config templates module. So you don't even have to write your actions manually anymore. So like I say, right now this is in dev. We're working on it here because I don't really want to touch features right now and make a lot of changes, so we're kind of experimenting in this config templates module with some alternatives so that maybe in a year or so you'll see features improved to a more usable tool in D8 that does something more like what we want here. So take a look at it. I'd love feedback on either of those modules in the issue queue. So to summarize, stop using features, please. I won't be upset, I promise. One less issue queue for me to look at. Go ahead and use the built-in configuration, config export, config import. Try to stay away from that partial option. I've seen it on a fair number of projects that I've looked at. So take a look at, understand why you're using it and get rid of it if you can. Use that core patch. Start using that core patch so you can install config from your profile. If you have profiles, start to convert to profiles. It will make your life easier. Give some comments in that issue queue to the core people. Like, let's try to get this RTB seed so we can get it in 8.4 before the cutoff date. I don't even know when that is, actually. Soon. Was it Monday? Oh, we're too late. There might still be a chance. Get used to using Git. I mentioned this. Manage all your changes now through Git. When you change config, you'll just see it as a normal Git change, just like your code. So get used to doing that. When you need to do environment-specific stuff, go look at config split. Help improve config split. Like, I think config split is another great candidate to be in core eventually, but it's still kind of a new concept this year, so it's certainly not 8.4. But let's maybe try to help improve that as well. And then finally, if you're really adventurous and you want to look towards the future, start trying out config actions and config templates. Give me your feedback and see if that solves some of your problems instead of using features. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions. I don't know how much time we actually have because the schedule's been pushed late. So somebody can just tell me when to stop and we can stop, but otherwise I'll take questions. Anybody? Sure. Yeah. So your configure, let's talk about the devel module as an example, because the devel module has config, right, as to how you set it up. So when you blacklist devel, you will also put your devel settings in your dev environment. And so on prod, it will do an import. The import won't have any devel settings. And before it has a chance to enable devel, it's going to get blacklisted, and so it won't get enabled, and so it won't have a problem. On your development machine, when it will do that merge at import time, so it will have the devel settings there, but it's going to enable, I don't know the exact order, but it basically enables the module, which then gives you the default config, and then it imports your devel config on top of that and overwrites it. So then you end up with your actual proper devel config. So you don't actually run into errors with, the config doesn't exist or anything like that if you put it in the right place. But make sure that when you blacklist a module, the config for that module should go into whatever split module the module is enabled in. Okay? Any other questions? Go ahead here. Oh, there, okay. Yep, so the question is, can we extend Lightning config with our own profile config? Yeah, that's actually our main use case. I'm also involved in there's a patch in core to do inherited profiles, and Lightning has adopted that and kind of taken over shepherding that. It's like a 4-year-old issue in Drupal that we've been working on a long time. And what it lets you do is in your profile, you can say, just like you can do a base theme, like when you do a theme, you can say base theme equals. In a profile now, with this patch, you can say base profile is Lightning, okay? And it will actually install Lightning, install its config, but then any config in your profile will overwrite that config and get installed as well. And I have tested doing a site using Lightning as an inherited profile, using this core patch to install from config, and it actually works. So that seems to be good. There's definitely areas there though, like I still feel like even now with these, like we're just talking about this new core patch, you know, at Drupal 8.3, right? This is still kind of new stuff, so there might still be some rough edges. And I'd really love, like if you run into something like this, like do a contact on Drupal.org for me and let me know. I'd love to hear what problems people might still be having so we can try to resolve and get these things cleaned up. Because I think it's super important to get this config stuff resolved because, you know, when I did the survey, I did a lot of research this past year trying to come to grips with features and what is the right way to do config. And I talked to a lot of internal phase 2 projects, but also to other vendors and read blogs out there. And internally, at least, where I had more data, I was just amazed how many hours developers spend in D8 dealing with config and unmet dependencies and pre-existing configuration and just all these errors and just how much of a struggle that is and how much of it was features and how much of it is base config. And so trying to resolve that is still a complicated question because we have a lot of different use cases. And I think this is the best way now, but there may be some other use cases out there that I've missed. So definitely let me know so we can improve this even more. Do we have a question here? No? Okay.
Okay, I have two main points with features, options.
Okay.
One is when I create fields, it's okay. But when I try to delete fields, I already have data.
Yep. Yep. So, and it's the same in D8. Features will not delete your data because you don't want to remove data, and it has no idea how to do that. And then, like I say, it's the same thing in D8. When you try to do that, D8 will try to stop you. Features won't necessarily stop you sometimes, but you have to delete it manually, right? Because it can't do that for you. So that's just the way it's designed. There's no fix for that, right? You have to write an update hook, you know, with your module, whatever that feature is in. You write an update hook that says, "Hey, delete this field," and do that. Now, in Drupal 8, if you try to delete stuff with normal config, it's going to complain that you have pre-existing configuration or pre-existing content. That's where the config actions module can actually help. It does stuff at a rather low level. The interesting experiment I tried was the use case of, hey, I need to change this field cardinality. Like the field used to be cardinality 1, like 1 date field, and now the client wants 2 date fields, so I have to change the cardinality to 2. Normally Drupal's not going to let you change the schema because they're existing content. In config actions, I was able to basically say delete the field storage and then recreate it with cardinality 2, and it doesn't touch the data. So when you do that deletion, yeah, now you've got orphan data, and that's bad. Don't leave your site like that. But then as soon as you recreate it with the new cardinality, your data's still there, and the first date value has what your date value used to be. And if, you know, so you can play games like that in D8 with config actions that you couldn't even do in D7 because you had to do it all manually. Yep. The other thing I'll point out, while we're talking about features for a second in 8, is I didn't put it on the slide, but the other common problem people are running into is not only does it not want to delete your data, but when it updates your info file for your module, it will not update, it will not remove dependencies because it doesn't know which dependencies you've added manually. Like, you know, maybe you added code to the module and now you have a dependency on, you know, panels or some other module. So when you go to update your feature, if you're refactoring stuff and like let's say you're moving your field storage to another module and then you update all your features, well, field storage is still listed in your previous one, and so now you still have an unmet dependency. And so a common, you know, step that I have people do is just go into the .info file, remove all the dependencies, let feature recreate them, and then you know you've got the right dependencies. We're probably going to add an option to features to let you regenerate your info file from the UI. So that's currently in discussion. But that's something that people are running into a lot is they thought they refactored, but their files still all had all these dependencies in it. Anybody else? Great. Well, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure being down here in Costa Rica. I love it.